My name is Elena Marquez. For years, I worked as a nurse, pouring my heart into caring for others. But what I'm about to share with you is something I never expected. An experience that shook me to my very core and yet filled me with more peace than I've ever known. The morning began like so many others, yet underneath the routine, I carried a heaviness I could not name. You know those days when you lace up your shoes, tie your hair back, and feel the weight of life pressing against your chest before the day even starts? That was me on that September morning. The alarm rang at 5:30 a.m., and I dragged myself from the bed, still tired though I had slept. The smell of coffee drifted through the kitchen as I brewed the same dark roast that had carried me through countless shifts. My husband kissed my cheek, telling me to take it easy. I smiled back, but inside I was already bracing myself for 12 more hours of pouring out what little energy remained. The corridors of the hospital greeted me with their familiar antiseptic sting, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, gurneys squeaking as they rolled past. Voices echoed patients calling out, nurses exchanging clipped instructions, doctors with pens tapping against clipboards. I had walked these halls for years, but that day felt different, like the walls themselves were carrying a strange heaviness. A younger nurse brushed past me, her arms full of supplies, whispering, "Busy morning already." I nodded and forced a smile, though my body felt drained. I ignored the dizziness that tugged at me, telling myself it was just fatigue, just another day. But deep down, something whispered otherwise. You've probably felt that strange tug before, haven't you? That quiet inner sense that something is about to shift, that the ordinary rhythm of your day will not hold. That was the whisper I carried as I adjusted a blood pressure cuff on a recovering patient. Then suddenly, the world tilted. My hands trembled. The cuff slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor. A rush of lightheadedness swept over me, and I leaned against the bed, trying to steady myself. "Elena, are you okay?" My coworker's voice cut through the haze, but I couldn't answer. My throat refused words, my vision blurred, colors smearing together. The monitor's beeps faded into silence until all I heard was ringing, like 1,000 tiny bells chiming at once. My knees buckled. The hospital floor rose up to meet me, but instead of crashing into pain, I felt myself falling without moving. One moment I was upright, surrounded by the clinical hum of machines, and the next I was outside of it all, as if the air had carried me elsewhere. I opened my eyes, or maybe my soul opened them, and there I was, watching from above. My body lay crumpled on the floor. Nurses swarmed, their hands pressing, voices urgent, movements frantic. And yet, I felt no fear, no panic clawed at me. Instead, a calm so deep settled over me that I laughed softly at the strangeness of it all. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't been there. Imagine carrying a backpack full of bricks every day of your life, every sorrow you absorbed, every patient you couldn't save, every sleepless night you dragged yourself through, and then, in an instant, setting it down. That's what it felt like. The sudden release of a burden so heavy you didn't know you were still carrying it. I wasn't gasping for air. My chest wasn't burning. My body's pain had dissolved. For the first time in years, I was light. The sounds of chaos below crash cart wheels, shouted instructions, gloves snapping faded into a strange harmony. It wasn't silence, but a melody that seemed to vibrate through my very being. Gentle, steady, like voices singing somewhere just beyond reach. The walls of the hospital began to dissolve, not crumble or break, but fade like mist under sunlight. What replaced them wasn't darkness. It was warmth, a radiance that wrapped around me like love itself had a temperature. I reached out instinctively to touch the shoulder of one of the nurses kneeling beside my body, wanting to tell her I was fine. But my hand slipped through her form, no resistance at all. I startled, then laughed again at the impossibility. The human world was still spinning in its panic, but I was hovering in something entirely different, something larger than life itself. Shock that was the first and strongest emotion, the main beat of this moment. Not fear, not despair, but shock that death, or what I thought was death, could feel like this. You imagine finality, darkness, a cold end. But instead it was release, lightness, even a strange curiosity about what was unfolding. The antiseptic tang, the whir of ventilators, the harsh fluorescent glare, all of it faded, and in its place, a softness came over everything, as though the world itself was exhaling. Looking down at myself, I realized I was standing at the threshold between two realities. One foot still in the hospital, the other already leaning into something else. That threshold is fragile, like a thin veil between what we call life and what is far more alive than we ever imagine. And as I hovered there, suspended in that liminal space, I knew nothing would ever be the same. Hovering above my body, I saw the nurses moving with urgency. Their voices were muffled, as if I were underwater, their hands pressing, their faces tense. I should have been terrified. I should have screamed to be pulled back, but what washed over me instead was awe, pure awe at the strange beauty of this moment. My chest didn't ache, my limbs didn't feel heavy. The strain I had carried for years as a nurse, the endless days of pouring myself out until I was empty, had slipped away like sand through my fingers. I felt light, untethered, as though gravity itself had no claim on me anymore. The strangest thing was the silence, not a hollow silence, but one filled with a gentle resonance, like the hum of a distant choir. The beeping monitors, the calls for the crash cart, even the pounding of feet against tile, all of it dissolved into a single vibration, soft and continuous. It wasn't just sound. It was music without instruments, a harmony that pulsed within me. Imagine 1,000 bells chiming at once, not clashing but blending, weaving together into something that felt like recognition, like home. That's what I heard. The walls around me began to shimmer. At first, I thought it was my vision playing tricks, but then the entire hospital faded, not collapsing but melting, as mist does when sunlight touches it. The sterile halls, the sharp edges of gurneys, the fluorescent ceiling, they gave way to something more fluid, as though the very air had been painted with light. The light didn't blind me, it embraced me. It radiated warmth without heat, safety without boundaries. You know the feeling of stepping out of a cold night into a room where a fireplace has been burning for hours, that sense of comfort rushing into your bones? That's the closest I can compare it to. I looked back at my body. Nurses leaned over, pressing on my chest, their lips moving in frantic commands. One called my name again and again, Elena. But her voice came from far away, echoing across a canyon. I wanted to answer. I wanted to say, "Don't cry. Don't fight for me. I'm fine." But when I tried to speak, no sound came. Instead, a thought rose up, and it was as if the air itself understood. I realized words weren't needed here. Communication was happening in some deeper current. As the earthly scene faded, a new awareness took its place. I wasn't bound by walls anymore. I was standing, or maybe floating, in a vast openness. The air shimmered with particles of light, like golden dust suspended in water, alive and moving in rhythm. Every flicker carried intention, like whispers of love in physical form. My spirit reached toward it without hesitation. Awe was the only word I had, though it didn't even come close. You know the feeling of seeing a sunrise after the darkest night of your life? That sudden swell in your chest that makes your eyes water because you're overwhelmed by beauty? That's the emotion that filled me. My spirit trembled not in fear but in reverence. There was a ringing sensation too, not painful, not piercing, but steady, like the vibration after a bell is struck. It seemed to resonate through everything, through me, through the space around me, through whatever dimension I had entered. It was as if creation itself had a pulse, and for the first time, I was tuned into it. And yet, as much as awe wrapped around me, curiosity stirred inside too. Where was I? What was this light that seemed alive? This melody that seemed to breathe? Was I crossing into eternity, or had I wandered into some strange dream of my exhausted mind? My thoughts scattered, but each question seemed to dissolve into the warmth itself, as if the place knew me better than I knew myself. I tried once more to reach for the scene below. My colleagues' faces were faint now, blurred like reflections in water. The crash cart's clang had disappeared into the harmony. Their urgency didn't belong to me anymore. My backpack of bricks, the burden of long nights, of sorrow absorbed from countless patients, of emptiness I never confessed had been taken off. I was weightless. It was then that I laughed again, softly, like a child who discovers something wondrous. Because in that moment, I knew I wasn't dying as I had once feared. I was awakening. Death wasn't an end. It was a door. And I was stepping through, carried not by my own strength, but by something greater, something that had been calling to me long before this day. The music of that place carried me further from the sterile chaos of the hospital until the last echoes of Earth's noise fell away. And then it began something I had heard others describe in fragments, but nothing could prepare me for the reality of it. My life unfolded before me, not like a film projected onto a screen, but as if I were stepping into every memory at once. Each moment was alive, textured, pulsing with meaning I had never noticed. I was a child again, sitting on the wooden porch of my grandmother's house, the air heavy with the scent of blooming lilacs. She rocked in her chair, her voice thin but steady as she sang hymns that carried into the evening air. Her wrinkled hands clapped softly in rhythm, and I felt again the security of leaning against her knee, believing love was endless. Then the scene dissolved, and I was in my mother's kitchen, the smell of Sunday soup rising from a pot as laughter tumbled from my father's chest. These weren't distant recollections, they were immersive, as though I were there, breathing them in, reliving the warmth. The memories leapt forward. I was in a hospital room, my hands holding those of a woman trembling before surgery. I whispered that she wasn't alone. I remembered saying it for her, but in this place, I understood I had said it for myself too. The memory shifted to a patient who wept in silence, and I had simply sat beside him, offering my presence. These little acts, ones I had considered trivial, suddenly expanded before me. I saw ripples moving outward, touching others I had never met, as if love had multiplied far beyond the moment of giving. Humility rose up in me, thick and overwhelming. I had never thought of myself as extraordinary. I was just a nurse, clocking in and out, doing my best to ease pain where I could. Yet here I saw how every whispered prayer, every exhausted smile, every gentle touch had carried light into places I never realized. You've probably had moments too tiny acts of kindness you assumed were forgotten, but they're not forgotten, they are alive. They ripple through eternity like waves in water. The review didn't spare me either. I saw the times I had been impatient, the moments I had spoken in frustration, the nights I chose silence when I could have spoken kindness. But even in these, I didn't feel condemnation. Instead, I felt truth pure, unfiltered truth. And truth wasn't cruel. It was sobering, yes, but wrapped in compassion so deep that I could face it without collapsing. It was as if love itself said, "Do you see, this too can be healed." One detail burned into me, my grandmother's hymn. In that porch memory, her voice had cracked, thin and worn. But here, in this life review, I heard it layered with something greater. As she sang, it blended with unseen voices, harmonies that lifted her fragile tone into something eternal. Her simple faith, passed to me in that song, had woven itself into my story, into every act of care I would later give as a nurse. That hymn became a thread, binding generations, pulling me closer to the heart of God without me even knowing. The humility deepened as I watched my own face bent with exhaustion, my hands trembling after long shifts. Tears had fallen into my palms in bathroom stalls when I thought no one saw. But here, I saw they had been seen all along. They weren't wasted, they were offerings, soaked into eternity like rain into soil. You see, the tidbit I carried from this part was clear. Small things matter. That hymn sung on a porch, that bowl of soup, that single hand held in silence, they echo louder in eternity than grand speeches or headlines ever could. And awe began to merge with gratitude, with the realization that my life had not been meaningless or hidden. Every act of service had been noticed, every ripple of light had been counted. And then a voice, not spoken aloud but resounding within, asked me gently, "Do you see how much light you've carried into the world?" I turned toward it, though the source was not yet revealed. It wasn't just sound, it was love speaking directly into my soul. The words didn't flatter, they unveiled. They showed me that while I thought I had been pouring from an empty cup, in truth I had been pouring light that was never mine to begin with. Humility wrapped me like a cloak, not crushing but grounding. I bowed inside myself, trembling with both wonder and the weight of what I had overlooked. My whole life, I had thought I was just surviving shifts, just enduring exhaustion. But here, I was shown the truth. I had been participating in a tapestry woven by unseen hands. The light that had been surrounding me shifted, drawing closer, thickening until it wasn't simply atmosphere anymore, it was presence. It pulsed with recognition, as though every cell of my soul already knew it. And then I saw him. At first, it was only a glow brighter than the already radiant horizon, but then features emerged, not in the way we see faces on earth, but in the way the heart suddenly knows it is being seen. His presence filled everything, bending the very air around him, and when my spirit recognized him, the only word that escaped me was Jesus. He smiled. His eyes were not just eyes, they were oceans, endless and layered with truth and love woven together. Looking into them was like staring into eternity and safety at the same time. My spirit leaned forward, like a child reaching into her father's arms. And though my lips never moved, my soul whispered his name again, and he nodded with warmth that melted every wall I had ever built around my heart. Then he spoke, not in sound, but in a vibration that resonated through every part of me. My daughter, you have served with your hands, you have wiped tears, you have carried pain, and in doing so, you have carried me. His words pierced through me, like light flooding into a darkened room. Suddenly, I realized that all the weary nights in the hospital, all the quiet prayers whispered when no one listened, every drop of compassion poured out when I thought I had nothing left, all of it had been seen. None of it had been wasted. Love that was the overwhelming emotion of this moment. Not love as sentiment, not love as fragile or fleeting, but love as a force so vast it became the very air I breathed. It saturated me, filled the cracks of my being, washed over the shame I had carried in silence. I thought of the times I felt like a failure, nights I believed I wasn't enough for my patients or my family. His gaze erased all of that with one truth: love had been enough. The tidbit burned into me from this encounter was simple but seismic. Every act of service is sacred. On earth, we measure value in outcomes, in what can be seen, tallied, or celebrated. But in his presence, I understood something deeper. The smallest act of love carries eternal weight. When I held a trembling hand, I held his. When I whispered comfort, I echoed his voice. When I wept in silence for someone else's pain, those tears mingled with his. The ground, or what felt like ground beneath me, glowed softly, reflecting his light. It shimmered like dew touched by sunrise, and I realized I was no longer hovering aimlessly. I was standing in something real, yet more alive than any floor or soil I had known. The very air seemed to pulse with awareness, as if creation itself leaned toward him, rejoicing in his nearness. I longed to collapse at his feet, though I wasn't sure if I even had knees in this form. All I knew was that I wanted to yield completely, to rest in the safety of that love. My soul trembled not in fear, but in surrender. And Jesus reached out. His light touched me, and when it did, a flood of visions began to pour into my being. They weren't stories told in words. They were realities I stepped into. I saw my nights in the hospital again, but this time through his eyes. I saw him standing beside me when I prayed for patients, his hand resting on theirs through mine. I saw him collecting the tears I thought were wasted, storing them as though they were treasure. I saw him smiling when I whispered, "You're not alone," because I was speaking his heart. And then I understood. I had never been working alone. Every act of service had been shared with him. I had carried him without knowing. The love deepened, pressing in with a weight that didn't crush but healed. My heart opened wider than I thought possible, stretching to hold what was being poured in. I realized that on earth we live like cups, always fearing we'll run dry. But in his presence, we are rivers, fed from a source that never ends. My exhaustion, my emptiness, it hadn't been the end of me. It had been the doorway for him to flow through. I wept, though I don't think tears fell the way they do on earth. It was more like my soul itself sobbed with relief and recognition. For the first time in my life, I felt fully understood, fully safe, fully whole. And in that moment, I knew this encounter wasn't just for me. It was for you too, for every weary soul who wonders if their little acts matter, if their sacrifices go unseen. I am here to tell you, nothing is wasted. Not a tear, not a touch, not a prayer whispered in fatigue. All of it is counted, and all of it carries him. The light around me shifted again, and suddenly I was standing or floating in a place that felt both familiar and entirely other. It was a garden, but unlike any I had ever walked through on earth. Every color seemed alive, vibrating with its own song. Flowers shimmered with hues I had no names for, their petals glowing as if they held fire from within. Trees stretched upward, their leaves moving not just with a breeze, but in rhythm, as though creation itself were worshipping. The air was fragrant, sweet like lilies, yet warm like fresh bread, carrying a comfort that sank into me deeper than air ever could. In the center of that garden, faces began to appear. At first they were faint, like reflections on water, but then they sharpened, glowing brighter than the sun, yet familiar in ways that made my heart ache. I saw patients I had cared for over the years, people I thought had forgotten me, people I thought I had failed, and yet here they were, radiant, free of pain, clothed in light. Their smiles reached into me, pulling tears I didn't know I had left. One man stepped forward, and I knew him instantly. He had been so afraid before his surgery, gripping my hand with desperation, whispering prayers between sobs. I remembered staying late that night just to sit with him, though I was bone tired, whispering words of comfort I wasn't even sure he heard. And now, here he was, standing tall, his fear replaced by radiance, his voice steady as he said, not with lips, but with light, "Your touch reminded me I wasn't alone." That one moment changed everything. Gratitude overwhelmed me, so strong I thought it might undo me. I had carried years of doubt, believing I hadn't done enough, that my exhaustion had left gaps too wide to fill. But here I saw the truth. No kindness is forgotten. Every act of love, no matter how small, becomes eternal. The garden itself seemed to echo this truth, every flower and tree and note of fragrance declaring that love never dies. I saw others too, faces of those who had passed, glowing brighter than I could bear. A woman who had slipped into eternity under my care smiled at me, and I felt her gratitude like a tide rushing in. I saw children whose eyes once brimmed with fear now dancing in the light, free of every shadow. Each one carried a message without words. What you gave mattered. What you poured out was not lost. The tidbit that anchored itself into my soul from this vision was clear. Heaven remembers what earth forgets. The chart notes, the schedules, the endless rotations, all those things faded, but the moments of compassion remained carved into eternity. The smallest gestures had been woven into something far larger than I ever understood. Gratitude wrapped around me like a garment. It wasn't just mine, it radiated from them as well. Their thankfulness wasn't only directed toward me, it was directed toward the love that had moved through me. I realized that I had only ever been a vessel. The true healer was standing beside me, smiling, his eyes glimmering with compassion. Jesus whispered to my heart, "Every act of love is my light shining through you. And now you see its fruit." I fell inwardly to my knees, undone by the realization. The garden pulsed with joy, alive with reunion, every soul a testimony of grace. And though my mind wanted to hold on to each detail, my spirit simply rested in the gratitude, knowing this was only the beginning of what he had to show me. I had carried this question through 1,000 midnights, and there, in the garden of living souls, it rose again, not as accusation, but as ache. Why so much pain? Why the kind ones bent under weight that seemed built for giants? Why the long corridors of grief that never seemed to end, even for those who prayed until their throats burned? The light did not recoil from my ache. He drew nearer, as if my question were an open door he had long hoped I would unlock. I felt something in me loosen, a grip I did not know I kept. My will, so practiced in fixing things, released its hold. Surrender settled over me like a warm shawl laid across tired shoulders. You know that moment when you stop bracing, when your ribs finally admit the breath they've refused for hours? That was me. I let the question stand in the air like incense, curling upward, unafraid of being judged for asking. The garden hushed. Even the colors seemed to lean in. I did not hear a lecture. I received a knowing. It entered me the way dawn enters a room. Not all at once, but in widening bands of gold. Pain is preparation. The words were not syllables, they were substance. They carried weight without crushing, light without blinding. I saw how my years at the bedside had carved space within me, space where compassion could live without choking. Suffering had not been a punishment. It had been a hollowing, the faithful shaping of a vessel that could hold a larger mercy. On earth, I had called it depletion. Here, I recognized it as formation. Images rose like tides. A mother holding vigil beside a son who would not wake, her fingers tracing circles on the sheet to keep from unraveling. A widower folding his wife's sweater and placing it back on the chair, the scent of her shampoo rising like a prayer. A nurse, my own face, pressing a cool cloth to a fevered brow at 3 a.m, eyelids sanded raw from lack of sleep. In each scene, love leaned forward through pain, as if pain were the doorway love chose to enter by. A strange reverence welled up in me for the ones who do not turn away in those hours. You have been there too, maybe not in a ward or a waiting room, but beside a bed where a name was repeated like a mantra because names are anchors when storms lift the floor. You know the feel of minutes that stretch thin as paper, the hush that makes the smallest sound holy. This is where I understood something I could never accept on earth. Pain was not proof of abandonment. Pain had often been the meeting place. the hidden chapel where the presence waited without fanfare. A softness settled over the scene, like a blanket pulled to the chin of a sleeping child, soft breath, slow hum, warm palms. The tenderness of it undid me. I saw the years I had labeled failure, the prayers that ended with silence, the mornings I drove home beneath a gray sky, the feeling that all my pouring out had leaked through cracks I could not seal. In the light, those cracks were not shame, they were channels. What I thought had escaped had in truth been carried farther than I could imagine. The tidbit I must give you because it anchored me is simple enough to memorize. Pain is preparation. Not the kind that grinds you to powder and leaves you without a face, but the kind that opens a door you didn't know existed, a door into the deep place where love learns its true name. It does not make evil good. It does not bless cruelty. It names what God can form from wreckage when nothing else will reach us. I saw an elderly man who had lived in bitterness soften during his final month because a volunteer came every afternoon to read to him about sunlit orchards and river bridges. I saw a teenager who never knew gentleness hold his little sister's hand through a fevered night and learn, without a single sermon, that love can be fierce and unafraid. I saw a woman who could not forgive herself for a decade sit beneath a maple tree and finally allow tears to fall, and how those tears watered ground that would later bloom in the life of a neighbor she barely knew. Threads, all of them, and yet together they formed fabric strong enough to lift entire families. I thought of my own stubborn heart, how I had kept score of hurts, how I had bristled against the unfairness of the world. The light did not scold me. He drew near, nearer still, until my defenses felt unnecessary and slipped away like a coat in spring. Surrender deepened, not as defeat, but as alignment. You know that click when a key finally turns in a stubborn lock. That sound rang through me. Something opened. The garden brightened along its edges, colors rinsed in fresh luminosity. The fragrance shifted too, gathering notes of citrus and honey, then settling into a quiet warmth like bread, just out of the oven, soft steam, slow exhale, gentle heat. I realized that even beauty is an answer. It does not argue, it accompanies. It does not explain the wound. It lays a balm along its edges until the skin remembers how to close. A scene returned from the hospital. A man whose body had become a map of scars asked me once, without words, if it was worth fighting for one more day. I had squeezed his hand and stayed through the shift change, and when my relief arrived late, I did not let go. In that moment, I thought I had offered only minutes. Now I saw what those minutes had done. Time had stretched around that bed like a shelter, long enough for one buried memory to surface and be forgiven. The forgiveness had not cured his body, but it had lifted a stone from his chest so he could breathe differently, even as he slipped away. Pain had prepared him to receive what he had refused while strong. The opening had not been a failure, it had been salvation's ordinary door. I turned this understanding toward the ache I carried for my own family fears, about the hours I had missed, the meals I had skipped, the words I had swallowed to keep working. The light wrapped those fears the way sea foam wraps a shell and carries it gently back to shore. I felt the mercy of being seen, not evaluated, seen, and I yielded again. If this is preparation, then let the preparation complete its work. You might wonder what becomes of anger in such a place. It does not vanish by decree. It loosens because there is finally room for it to breathe without burning. The heat that once licked at your ribs becomes a small fire over which something nourishing can be warmed. I felt that in my own chest, anger cooling into clarity, then into courage, then into consent. I did not consent to evil. I consented to transformation. The garden hummed a low, steady chord as if an unseen choir held a single note for the world. I rested in it, and for the first time, I did not try to hurry the resting. Rest is not the enemy of mission. Rest is the forge where mission is tempered. How many years had I mistaken frantic effort for faithfulness? How many times had I refused the shelter held open for me because I confused collapse with surrender? There, under that humming chord, the difference became simple. Collapse ends in emptiness. Surrender ends in fullness, because surrender is trust. I want you to feel what I felt then. Place your hand against your chest for a moment. Feel the small rise and fall. Let the shoulders drop one notch. Let the jaw unhook.
Hear the normal sounds around you turn soft for 10 seconds. Soft whisper, slow drift, gentle hush. In that small space, imagine the words inscribed along your sternum, where you cannot erase them. Pain is preparation. Let the words glow, not to glorify the wound but to dignify the work that is happening under it. I understood then why some of the quietest people I had known radiated a strength that needed no announcement. They had walked through furnaces and learned how not to carry smoke. Their lives were instructions without a single lecture, and I knew this too. The ones who are most ready for the work ahead are not always the loud ones. Readiness often sounds like a soft yes said in a kitchen at dawn, like a single candle steadied in a trembling hand. Surrender held me, and I did not fight its embrace. The garden seemed to widen, as if my consent enlarged the horizon. I did not ask what came next. I allowed next to come. The ache was still the ache, but it had a place to sit now. It was no longer pacing the edges of my mind. It sat quietly beside me, and we listened for the same music. When the light moved, I moved too, not by command, but by belonging. And I carried the simple truth with me like a seed in the pocket of my gown. Pain is preparation. The horizon itself seemed to tremble, and I knew the garden was giving way to something far greater. Light gathered, folding into layers upon layers, until suddenly the whole expanse of earth was stretched out beneath me. It turned slowly. The blues of oceans, the greens and browns of land, clouds swirling like brushstrokes across a canvas. But I was not merely observing. I was inside a revelation, as if the very soul of creation was opening its heart before me. Then I saw it etched across the sky like fire inscribed on glass. September 20th, 2025. The date pulsed, brighter and brighter, until it vibrated inside my chest. My spirit trembled, not with fear but with reverence. It was as though eternity itself had circled this day in gold long before I drew breath. A golden river of light poured downward, threading through cities and deserts, mountains and villages, weaving across every nation. It wasn't destruction, it was awakening. Jesus stood beside me, his gaze fixed on the earth, and his voice thundered and whispered at once, "This is the day chosen. On this day, my light will touch the earth in a way it never has before." The atmosphere shifted like the air before a storm, heavy with promise, electric with expectancy. I saw people scattered across the globe. Some were kneeling in churches, their lips moving in prayer. Others were walking in crowded streets, unaware of heaven's nearness. Farmers bent over fields, children ran through schoolyards, mothers rocked infants in tired arms. And then the light touched them. It wasn't the same for all. Some fell to their knees, weeping with joy. Some reached upward as if to catch the radiance. Others froze, stunned and trembling. It struck me with force. Heaven and earth would brush against each other on that day. The veil that had always kept eternity hidden would thin. For those prepared in love, it would feel like homecoming. For those living only in fear, it would feel like fire. Reverence filled me, a holy weight pressing into every corner of my being. I could hardly breathe under the immensity of it. Yet I didn't want to turn away. My mind whispered questions. Would the world call this science? Would they call it madness? But my spirit already knew. Labels would not matter. This light would not be explained away. It would not be denied. The tidbit seared into me from this vision was clear. September 20th, 2025 would not be another date on a calendar. It would be a doorway, and every soul would have to decide whether to step through or to turn away. I felt the golden current wrap around me like liquid fire, soft and searing at once, and I realized why I had been brought to this vision. It was not to marvel at the spectacle. It was to carry the message back, to whisper into ears still clouded by noise, "Prepare your heart." Because on that day, love will come in waves, undeniable, unstoppable, uncontainable. The vision widened, and I was no longer looking at the globe from above. Instead, I stood in a vast open field, endless in every direction, lit with golden light that seemed to ripple like the surface of a living sea. All around me, souls began to gather multitudes beyond counting. They weren't strangers, they were family, though I had never met them before. They came from every corner of the earth, every language, every age. Their faces glowed, their laughter was pure, their embraces carried the weight of reunion after lifetimes apart. The air vibrated with joy. Yet, even in that overwhelming joy, I noticed something else. Some souls were radiant, their eyes bright with recognition, their bodies wrapped in light as though they had come home at last. Others, though, stood at the edges of the gathering, and they looked confused, restless, uncertain. Their eyes darted as if they didn't know where they belonged. The light touched them too, but instead of embracing it, they flinched, as though it was a fire burning away the shadows they had grown comfortable with. I turned to Jesus, my heart aching with questions. He stood at the center, his presence binding the entire multitude together, his love radiating equally to all. Before I spoke, he answered the cry of my soul. Those who have lived in love will feel this light as homecoming. Those who have lived in fear will feel it as fire. But all are loved. And even for those who turn away, my call will not end. Urgency surged through me. It was not the frantic urgency of earth, but the holy urgency of eternity pressing close. Every soul mattered. Every choice was eternal. I realized then that the awakening of September 20th would not be a singular moment of division, but an invitation, a chance for the fearful to awaken, for the wandering to remember. I saw mothers reunited with children they had lost, their embraces shimmering like waterfalls of light. Fathers clasped the hands of sons. Daughters fell into the arms of parents who had gone before them. Friends long separated by oceans or death laughed together again, their joy echoing through the field like music. It was reunion, redemption, restoration. Yet the restless ones gripped my attention. Their faces carried sorrow, confusion, resistance. They did not recognize the love surrounding them, as though they had spent so long hiding in shadows that the light felt like a stranger. I wanted to run to them, to take their hands, to say, "Don't you see? You are loved too. This is your home." But I understood. Even love cannot force its way into a heart. Love can only call and wait and call again. The tidbit that carved itself into me was this: heaven and earth would brush together, but the experience would depend on the heart's posture. For those who lived in love, it would be embrace. For those who lived in fear, it would be exposure. The choice would not be forced, but it would be clear. Jesus placed his hand upon my shoulder, his touch both firm and tender. His gaze swept the multitude, his eyes filled with a sorrow deeper than oceans and a hope brighter than suns. "Elena," he whispered into my soul, tell them not to wait until the light burns. Tell them to choose love now, so that when the veil opens, they will recognize it as home." The field swelled with radiance, waves of light rolling through the gathered souls like tides. Those who embraced it shone brighter, lifting their hands in worship, their voices blending into the eternal song. Those who resisted stepped back, shielding their eyes, torn between longing and fear. My spirit trembled, realizing that this was not only a vision of the future, it was a mirror of the present. Even now, souls live either leaning toward the light or recoiling from it. Urgency deepened into resolve. I knew then that I could not keep silent, not if I truly loved. For every soul, radiant or restless, mattered. Every one was being invited, every one was being pursued. The day of awakening was not meant to terrify but to call, not to condemn but to unveil. And in that unveiling, every heart would know what it had chosen. The field of souls dimmed at its edges, the golden light folding into itself until once again I stood with Jesus in the radiance that felt more alive than breath. His gaze locked into mine, and I felt his words rise within me before he even spoke. "You must go back." My whole being recoiled at the thought. To leave this place of safety, of love, of revelation, and return to the weary corridors of earth felt unbearable. But even as my spirit resisted, something deeper stirred a sense that this was not abandonment, but commission. I whispered within myself, "Why me? I am not strong enough. I am not holy enough. I am just a nurse, an ordinary woman." His eyes softened, oceans of compassion washing through me. "You are not chosen because you are perfect," his voice said without sound. "You are chosen because you were willing. Direction matters more than perfection. Every time you chose compassion when bitterness tempted you, every time you whispered prayer instead of surrendering to despair, you stepped toward me. That is readiness." Resolve began to take root where fear had lived. His words struck me like a bell, ringing with clarity that left no room for doubt. Being chosen was not about status or brilliance. It was about the quiet, yes, the willingness to keep choosing love even when it cost something. I thought of long nights when my body screamed for rest, but I stayed to hold a trembling hand. I thought of moments when anger burned in me, but I swallowed it and spoke comfort instead. Each small decision had become a step toward him, forming a path I had never noticed until now. The tidbit etched itself into my soul. Direction matters more than perfection. So many live shackled by fear of failing God, believing that one mistake can erase their worth. But in his presence, I understood. He looks at the heart's direction, the posture of love. Stumbling forward toward him is still forward. Perfection was never the measure. Love was. Resolve surged through me like fire that did not consume but refined. I realized that my life had been preparation not for escape but for mission. Every prayer whispered in exhaustion, every tear shed in silence, every moment I doubted yet chose to keep serving. They had formed a testimony that was not mine to hoard. It was a message for others still wandering, still weary. Jesus' presence pressed closer, his hand glowing over my heart. "You will be my voice. Tell them that love is never wasted. Tell them to prepare for the day when my light will cover the earth. Tell them it is not to be feared, but embraced. And tell them I am closer than they believe." His command was not a burden. It was a flame placed inside me, a steady fire that would not go out. I bowed inwardly, trembling, yet I felt no dread, only resolve. If he was sending me, then he would walk with me. If he was entrusting me with this message, then he had already woven the strength into my soul. The urgency I had felt in the field of souls settled now into clarity. I would go back, and I would speak, not with my own power, but with his. I came back, gasping, as if surfacing from deep water into fluorescent light. The hospital rushed in. The sting of antiseptic, the metallic click of a monitor, the sharp ache behind my ribs as the world reasserted itself. Someone's voice called my name, urgent and wet with relief. Hands steadied me. The crowd of faces so small from up there, so large now, flooded me with questions and prayers. I blinked against the harshness of those lights, and the memory of another light that felt like home still clung to my skin like warm oil. Hope, that was the main thing waiting for me now, threaded through fear and wonder and a clarity I hadn't carried before. You remember how the hospital smelled when you were a child visiting someone sick, the mix of bleach and flowers, the quiet footsteps in the corridor. It hit me then, but different. Softer, somehow, like a memory replayed through velvet. Nurses hugged me. My husband's hand closed around mine so hard it hurt, and I let him hold me because the hold was an anchor to the life I had promised to continue. The doctor shook his head in professional astonishment and called out vitals, but my mind was not in the numbers. I kept seeing the garden, the faces, the date etched in gold. The visions weren't slipping away. They were sitting behind my ribs, steady and warm. I told them the basics, what happened in the concrete, practical way a nurse does when charting an event. I described the collapse, the rhythm of the machine alarms, the procedures they'd done to bring me back. But between those clinical facts, I felt a pressure that was not medical, a charge to speak the rest. And when I tried to share the light, the garden, the man whose eyes were oceans. Some listened with wide, wet eyes, and some furrowed against skepticism. A few frowned, the old armor of rationality shielding them. But you know how it is words land differently, depending on the heart that hears them. My first attempts were halting. I told a friend about the patient who had been afraid and was now radiant, and she wept without shame. I whispered the line that had lodged in me, "Pain is preparation," and watched it settle into the heart of a weary night shift nurse who had loved but felt empty. Other times I spoke of the date, the glow that had stamped September 20th, 2025 into the horizon, and a young doctor rolled his eyes, muttering something about coincidence and stress. I didn't argue. I learned quickly that conviction can't be forced into another's jaw. You plant seeds, you water, you wait. Yet there were moments of grace that surprised me. A janitor who had a habit of whistling hymns at odd hours pressed his palm against my hand and said, "I've been feeling a warmth for weeks." A patient's daughter came to my bedside a week later and said she'd seen a light over the city while driving and had stopped the car to pray she thanked me for something she thought I hadn't done. Small confirmations, soft, almost ridiculous in their gentleness, proved the vision wasn't only mine. The hospital itself, once all edges and urgency, now seemed to hold traces of that golden shimmer in unexpected places. The way sunlight through the blinds cut across the linoleum, the hush before shift change that felt like a breath held in prayer. That shimmer became the tidbit I carried. Sometimes heaven leaves fingerprints in the ordinary. I found that living with the vision changed how I moved through my days. I still stocked meds, still charted wounds, still steadied trembling hands at 3 a.m., but I did those things with an added tenderness. When a family argued over a DNR, I listened differently. When a lonely patient asked for someone to sit, I stayed longer. My tiredness didn't vanish. The backpack of bricks returned at night, but its edges had been softened by a promise that the small acts of love would matter in ways unseen. You learn, quickly, that mission doesn't exempt you from exhaustion. It repurposes it. People asked what they should do. I told them plainly, love more, forgive sooner, speak truth gently, and pray not from panic but from a steady trust. Prepare your heart, clean it of bitterness, mend the frays of relationships, stop hoarding kindness. The world would keep its schedules and scandals, but on that day the veil would thin. Some would step through with a song, others would flinch away. Your posture matters. Direction matters more than perfection. That sentence, simple and sharp, became my anchor in conversations and in the quiet hours when doubts crept in. As weeks went by, small shifts occurred. A neighbor I hardly knew returned a long-forgotten favor with tears and a confession that set her free. A patient asked to be read the old hymns I had hummed in my grandmother's kitchen. His voice grew stronger. I saw people tilt, little by little, toward light. Not every story turned miraculous in a headline way, but I watched hearts rehearse the habit of opening, and in each small opening, hope flared. Hope is not naive. It is a disciplined thing. It thrives in the cracks. It grows through ordinary gestures repeated faithfully. I woke each morning aware that I had been given a message, and that the work of carrying it would be unglamorous and sacred. I would be called to whisper into crowded rooms, to sit with skepticism, to plant seeds in soil that sometimes looks barren. And I would do it because I had been with him, because love had poured through me and changed the way I breathed. Slow now. Let the words sink. Breathe in, out. Slow as prayer. The light I was shown did not feel like a threat. It felt like a hand offering direction. It was not a call to panic, but an invitation to remember who you are. A beloved, imperfect, readying heart. If these words resonate with you, leave an amen in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and share it with at least 3 friends or family members right now. Now is your time to make a difference. Spreading this message is not only an act of love, but also a mission that Jesus himself has entrusted to you.